I was the woman he swore he'd marry, the one who helped him build his empire from scratch. But when I found out he'd been networking with someone else in more ways than one, I didn't cry, beg, or scream. I smiled, because he had no idea I was already building his downfall. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, this story's for you. Hey, like, subscribe, and let's dive into how I turned heartbreak into poetic justice. My name's Clara Lewis, and until last year, I thought I was living the dream. I co-owned a digital marketing agency with my fiancé, Ethan Vale, the golden boy of our city's tech scene. Handsome, charming, charismatic, the kind of man who made people lean in when he spoke. We built Vale Plus Co Media from a 2-bedroom apartment with chipped walls and second-hand laptops. I was the strategist, the quiet engine. He was the face, the charm that closed deals and drew cameras. For 5 years, I gave everything. Late nights, unpaid overtime, caffeine dinners, and my entire savings account. We didn't just build a company, we built a future. Also, I fault. It started small, tiny cracks in the perfection we'd created. Ethan became busy. Always another meeting, another late-night client dinner. The man who used to text me mid-meeting with heart emojis now barely replied with K. I ignored it at first. People change under pressure, right? But then came the smell, a faint trace of perfume that wasn't mine. Not the kind of scent you pick up at Sephora. This was niche, expensive, the kind that lingers like a secret. Then the receipts, one from the Larchmont, a boutique hotel we'd once dreamed of visiting together when we made it. I laughed it off when I first saw it. Business meeting, I told myself, until I noticed the date, our anniversary. That night, when he came home, I tried to ask casually, "Rough day?" He kissed my forehead distractedly, eyes already on his phone. Long meeting, the usual. He didn't even notice the tremor in my voice when I asked, "At the Larchmont?" His eyes flicked up for half a second too long. Then the smile, the kind that tries to erase a lie before it's spoken. Client insisted on the location. He thought I'd drop it. I always had before. But something inside me shifted that night. The version of me who trusted, who waited, who forgave, she started to dissolve quietly, cell by cell. And in her place, something colder began to take shape. That's when I found the messages. It wasn't even hard. His iCloud synced to our shared Mac, an oversight born of arrogance. At 2:17 a.m., while he snored softly beside me, I saw her name appear in blue bubbles across the screen. "Can't stop thinking about you. You smell like trouble." Her name was Sienna Hart, a fashion influencer we'd hired 6 months earlier to promote a luxury skincare client. You know the type, glossy, curated, perfectly filtered. Ethan had called her a genius with engagement metrics. Turns out, he was very engaged. The messages spanned months, inside jokes, secret meetups, pictures I wish I could unsee, and one message that stopped my heart cold. "Once the funding round closes, I'll tell her. Promise, tell her." Me. So, it wasn't just cheating, it was replacement. He was building a new future, one where I didn't exist. I didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, I watched, studied. I learned every weakness of the man I used to love, and the woman who thought she'd stolen him. Ethan's company account showed large, unrecorded consulting fees. Sienna's brand had suddenly partnered with Vale Plus Co. on multiple high-profile campaigns, all funded by our investor money. He wasn't just betraying me emotionally, he was using company funds to bankroll his affair. That realization hit like electricity, burning, clarifying, unstoppable. I remember staring at my reflection in the mirror that night. My eyes looked different, sharper, almost predatory. For the first time in years, I didn't see a victim. I saw someone holding a loaded weapon made of truth, and I decided to wait. Because revenge, if done right, isn't loud, it's quiet, precise, surgical. I started documenting everything: screenshots, account statements, fake invoices, even his late-night hotel bookings, all carefully time-stamped, all stored on a hidden drive named Wedding Budget. By day, I smiled. By night, I planned. Every time he looked at me with that fake tenderness, I wanted to scream. But I didn't. I let him think I was still blind, still in love, still his. And when he proposed, with a diamond I unknowingly paid for, I smiled and said yes, because by then, I'd already decided how his story would end. He thought he was planning our wedding, but I was planning his ruin. And the best part, he'd hand me every weapon himself. For a while after I found the messages, the days smelt like burned sugar, sweet, then suddenly acrid. Everywhere I went there were reminders of the life I'd built, and the tiny fissures in its foundation. Our office hummed with the same fluorescent confidence as always. The ping of Slack messages, the soft clack of keyboards, the aroma of burnt coffee that our intern pretended not to notice. Clients praised Ethan in interviews. Investors toasted him at dinners. He was the golden boy. I was the invisible scaffolding. Inside the apartment, the pretense was a full-time job. I learned the choreography of a woman who didn't know her partner was dismantling her life. I answered calls with a laugh that sounded practiced. At parties I leaned into the motor of small talk, letting him shine. When friends asked how I was, I said the word great. So many times it almost became honest. But the nights were the worst. Sleep turned into a brittle illusion. I'd lie awake and feel the mattress memorize the shape of his absence. That was when the anguish turned inward, into a physical aching, a tightness behind my ribs, a metallic taste at the back of my tongue, heartbeats that felt too loud in my skull. I replayed their messages until the words scrubbed thin and raw. I imagined them together, the way he would brush her hair aside, the way she would laugh at jokes I hadn't heard, the pictures of hotel rooms on his phone, strangers' towels, morning light that wasn't mine. At first I tried the obvious things: confrontation, tears, the scene I'd watched in 1,000 movies where someone is caught and everything comes tumbling down. I texted Sienna once, from a burner number, with all the righteous fury of a wronged woman. Her reply was casual, almost bored. "He must be lost," she wrote. "Ethan and I are private about our lives." The dismissal cut me deeper than I expected. Not because of the words, but because she was right. He had been private about everything, except his smile. I tried to be the kind of pissed off that shows up and wrecks a man's life in front of his friends. I stormed into his office once, breath ragged, ready to humiliate him. But when I stood at the glass door watching him charm a room full of venture capitalists, a weird, cold calculation took the place of rage. There was no audience for my dramatic collapse. There were only people who would write headlines about my bitterness and file us under founder drama. I walked back to my car and staged a calm I didn't feel. The quiet approach had started to feel more powerful than the public one. The first real blowback I took was mine alone. I started losing clients. Small things, a late campaign deliverable here, a miscommunication there, but each was a sharp, personal betrayal. People who had trusted us suddenly wondered if the cracks were structural. Ethan went to meetings and returned with new promises and new partnerships that never quite materialized. I watched numbers dip in analytics dashboards like teeth being pulled one by one. The board called an emergency meeting. I sat across from them, the only woman at the table, and smiled as they spoke of fiduciary responsibility and brand stability. The subtext was clear: someone needed to be the scapegoat. "You're the strategist," said Harold, our oldest investor, in a tone that was oddly sympathetic. "Where's your oversight?" I could have told them the truth, that financial irregularities were artfully disguised in consulting expenses, that some of our influencer campaigns were ghost-funded by lines in our budget Ethan controlled. I could have told them about the late-night transfers, the off-books expenses with Sienna's agency. But truth, like medicine, sometimes had to be administered in doses. I had to decide which wounds to open and when, so I swallowed my defense and volunteered for the audit. "Let's be transparent," I said, "because if I showed weakness, if I stumbled, they'd eat me alive." I signed documents, produced spreadsheets, opened folders. Each line item I handed over was a small, surgical removal of an infection. My hands shook more than once as I printed reports. When I left the boardroom, someone had left a get-well-soon balloon in the lobby. I didn't laugh. During the audit, Ethan performed the role of grieving partner flawlessly. He would place his hand over mine in public and murmur, "We'll get through this," while sending Sienna details about my meetings in the privacy of his car. I found myself envying open betrayal. At least it would have been honest. Instead, I had to watch him spiral his charm into a weapon that killed rumors before they bred. The closer I looked, the more audacity I found. The hotel receipts lined up with client entertainment budgets. A vendor we'd never used before showed up on our books with invoices for creative consulting. That vendor, as it turned out, had an address that matched the studio Sienna listed on her public profile. When I confronted him about that, his brow furrowed and he said, "We were testing a new campaign. You know how flexible the creative process is." The way he said it, as if flexible covered adultery and theft in equal measure, made me want to break the nearest thing. There were small, bone-deep betrayals that hurt more than any headline ever could. Like the time I discovered he'd hidden our engagement ring in a box labeled office supplies during a routine inventory count. The day he proposed, I thought the ring was ours, a symbol of a life built together. Now it looked like a prop, an item he could stage with on cue. My friends tried to help. Some poured wine and said things like, "Dump him." Others offered platitudes that skimmed the surface of my pain. But platitudes don't fix bank statements. They don't scrub incriminating email chains from servers. They don't make investors stop asking questions. My closest friend, Nina, stayed by my side, helping me pick up loose ends of the company while I fought a war I hadn't asked for. Sometimes the simplest acts rattled me more than the big betrayals. One evening, Ethan and I shared a late dinner at the company's rooftop, a place where we'd once sketched out growth strategies on cocktail napkins. He reached across the table and brushed the back of my hand. "I'm sorry," he said, and I tasted iron on my tongue, even as I felt the warmth of his touch. The apology didn't land because of the words. It landed because of the implication. That he'd been caught. That he was sorry to be caught. Not sorry for what he did. The pressure started to compress my world. Sleep slipped further away. My chest tightened. I began to have these moments, brief, dizzying, where all the faces around me blurred, and one thought anchored me. If I didn't act, everything I'd built would be quietly dismantled. Not just my company, but my dignity, my future, the life I'd worked for. The person who had stolen my life had done it deliberately and with a smirk. Then came a moment that turned my private war into a personal crisis. I was in the server room late one night, checking backup logs. I'd insisted on a redundancy plan after some of our analytics had been corrupted in a previous glitch, when a message pinged across our private Slack, from Ethan to Sienna. The conversation was a single line. "Send the wire tonight. I'll have the consultant's invoice ready." My hands went numb as I scrawled back a trail of transaction memos, routing numbers, and an amount that could sink a mid-sized non-profit. He'd arranged for the money to be moved through one of our shell accounts, then funneled to a consulting firm that listed Sienna as its primary contact. This wasn't just betrayal anymore, it was theft, fraud. And I had every single breadcrumb recorded. I sat on the cold concrete floor of the server room with my back against a rack, and felt something shift. For months I had been patient, cataloguing, waiting, swallowing. But that message felt like a detonator. It was proof material, and for the first time I realized I could use it. Not in a messy, emotional way. Not in a late-night confrontation. No, I could do this surgically. I didn't go home that night. I sat at my desk and made copies, encrypted files, and printed documents. I called Nina and told her to clear her calendar. "Meet me at my place in an hour," I said. Her voice on the other end was wet with sleep, then suddenly alert. "Okay," she answered. "What's happening?" Before she arrived, I opened a folder on my hidden drive labeled Wedding Budget and added the latest receipt, the wire transfer authorization with Sienna's account number. I sat there, my finger hovering over the send button for hours, thinking, if I sent it to the board, would they fire Ethan immediately? If I took it to the authorities, How fast could I smear his name across headlines? Either path risked everything. My career, his, the company, the people who worked for us. But nothing felt like an option anymore, except action. Nina arrived with coffee and an expression that said she already guessed the answer. She saw the documents on my desk and sat down without asking. "What are you thinking?" she asked, soft but sharp. "Justice," I said, and the word tasted metallic in my mouth. "And a way to make sure he can't keep using other people's money to hide his choices." Her eyes met mine. She didn't flinch. "Do you want me to help?" At that moment, lying to the board felt less like cowardice and more like a strategic retreat. I would prepare a dossier, audited and clean. I would present it so the numbers couldn't be argued with. I would ensure that when the fall happened, it landed on the person who deserved it. I would still look like the calm, composed founder the city expects, but inside, something fierce and absolute had taken root. We started with a plan. Small, legal, airtight. Gather the evidence, secure it, then decide whether to go to the board first or present to law enforcement. The decision felt like holding a loaded gun and choosing which eye to spare. On the outside, I kept smiling and rehearsed the future where Ethan says sorry on a talk show. Inside, I was building a map of his collapse. That night, before we left the office, I opened his calendar and penciled in a meeting for the next afternoon. Investor pitch, private lunch. It was the same appointment pattern he used for Sienna. I saved a copy of his last emails. Then I locked everything away. As I left the building, the city breathed around me, neon and glass, and I felt an unexpected calm. The air no longer tasted like burned sugar. It tasted like something else, possibility. I had proof, motive, means. The war had a direction. And then my phone lit up, with a message that was not from Ethan. It was from a number I didn't recognize. The text was 3 words: "We need to talk." The unknown number's message, "We need to talk," sat on my screen like a live coal. I almost deleted it, almost decided to keep everything strictly inside the secure envelope I'd made for the board. But curiosity is a dangerous animal, and I'd never been very good at ignoring it. The reply came from a woman named Maya, an auditor at a small investigative firm I hadn't heard of. She said she'd been tipped off about irregularities tied to Veil plus Co. and wanted to know if I was the person to speak with. Her words were cautious, professional, and exactly the kind I needed. No drama, no moralizing, just the willingness to listen. I met her in a coffee shop that smelled of espresso and wet newspapers. I took the table near the window, so I could watch the street my brain had taken to needing escape routes. Maya arrived plain, in a sweater and no makeup, with a messenger bag that looked like it had been through worse storms than I had. She didn't look impressed by my title or the city skyline. She looked at the documents I slid across the table and blinked twice, like someone who'd seen worse and still recognized the shape of fraud. "This is thorough," she said, thumb tracing a wire transfer. "Who wrote this?" I answered honestly. "Me." She nodded slowly. "You understand the risks." I had been living with risk for months. The risk of losing everything. The risk of being seen as petty. The risk of criminal charges if anything about our accounting looked sloppy. But the bigger risk, the one I couldn't bear, was the risk of letting this go and watching those who trusted us get robbed. "I understand," I said. We made a plan. She would run an independent verification of the shells I'd found. She would tap into public records, subpoena whatever she could, without burning the trail back to me. I insisted on being invisible in this phase. If the investigation had even the faintest scent of revenge attached, the credibility would crumble. I'd armored myself with truth. I couldn't allow it to be dismissed as vengeance. Back at the office, the architecture of my life, polished concrete, glass conference rooms, framed cover stories, suddenly felt like the stage of a play I'd been writing all along. I started living in 2 simultaneous realities, the one where I smiled and negotiated, and the one where I dissected ledgers and rehearsed confrontations. The duality made me sharp, The adrenaline was addictive. I would catch myself smiling in meetings for no reason, then remember why, and feel the smile harden into something like steel. Nina became my co-conspirator in plain clothes. She had a talent for details, the exact thing I lacked in my merciless rush to strategize. While I curated the narrative and gathered the high-value proofs, she traced the smaller threads. The vendor who dissolved a year ago but had invoices still routing through our accounts. The temporary studio address that served as a mailbox for Sienna's creative firm. She called contacts quietly. She sat in on calls and pretended to be an intern on the phone, meaning every word she recorded was legitimate. We set up redundancies. Copies of everything went to encrypted drives buried in cloud accounts I'd opened under old company project names. Hard copies were stored in a safety deposit box under my maiden name. I hired a private server firm under a shell LLC that had less curiosity than a sleeping cat. Their job, I told myself, was to keep the pulses of evidence steady and safe. There were nights when planning felt like assembling a beautiful weapon. I'd map timelines in a spreadsheet, overlay messages with bank statements, align hotel bookings with invoices. The rhythm soothed me. There was a logic to it. Motive, opportunity, means. Each piece fit, until the picture of his guilt was as clear as a photograph. We rehearsed consequences too. I wanted the fall to be thorough, but not cataclysmic, to people who didn't deserve it. Employees who had no idea what was happening were insulated. I prepared talking points for HR that framed the eventual fallout as a governance failure, not as a collapse of a dream. My fury was not aimless, it had moral parameters. This was not punishment for being loved poorly, this was justice for theft and deception. And then there was Sienna. She represented an annoying variable, unpredictable, performative, and dangerously connected to Ethan's social orbit. I worried she might vanish suddenly, or lawyer up, or stage some Instagram martyrdom that would turn public opinion. So I set a different plan into motion for her, neutrality through leverage. I didn't want to ruin her life. I wanted to make sure she couldn't use charisma to rewrite facts. I discovered, through a combination of Nina's sleuthing and old receipts, that Sienna's brand had benefited from one-off sponsored events that lined up suspiciously with transfers from our accounts. I prepared a dossier that showed those spikes and matched them to screenshots from event pages, dated guest lists, and booking receipts. If she wanted to play at victimhood, I would show the receipts that proved where her success had actually been funded. The thought of her glossy life unraveling because of numbers made me strangely satisfied. The most delicate part of the plan was Ethan himself. I could have marched into the boardroom and brandished the evidence, demanded he be fired, and watched him crumble. That would have been messy in a way that left traces I couldn't control. He needed to fall in a way that left no ambiguity to anyone who mattered. Investors, clients, journalists. He had to be exposed at a moment when he couldn't charm his way out, when cameras and statements and audits all converged like a trapdoor. So I built that moment. I picked 3 levers: the board, law enforcement, and public accountability. The sequence mattered. First, the board had to receive a dossier that was immaculate, not a witch hunt, but a professional documentation of anomalies. When the board requested an independent audit, they'd have to go to a firm we had already briefed, the one Maya worked with. That audit would open a legal channel. From there, the Department of Justice division that handled healthcare and securities fraud would be notified. Once the legal wheels were turning, I would brief a trusted journalist, someone who'd covered corporate malfeasance without sensationalizing it. That would ensure the story reached the public in a way that emphasized facts, not gossip. Timing was everything. There was an investor luncheon scheduled for 3 weeks out, a glossy affair where Ethan would be the darling of the room. He'd planned to use the event to announce a new funding round and introduce Sienna as a creative partner, a move designed to cement her role and distract from any whispers. I marked that day on my calendar in red. We ran dry rehearsals. Nina and I made mock presentations, practiced handing files to the board with the measured calm of people performing an autopsy. We planned contingencies, If the board tried to bury the audit, we'd go to law enforcement first. If law enforcement moved slowly, we'd leak to the journalist to force speed. We even rehearsed the moment of public reaction, the perfect, staccato gasps after a reporter read a paragraph that meant everything. Some nights the plan felt like a masterpiece of cold artistry. Other nights, a gut-wrenching moral rot crept in. I would wake up thinking of Ethan's early days, the hungry, scrappy man who showed up at 6 a.m. with coffee, dreaming of changing the world with me. There's a certain cruelty in watching a person you once loved turn into a target. I told myself that people who turned kindness into a prop had already made their choice. I breathed in, breathed out, and reminded myself of what had been taken. Friends noticed the change in me. "You're getting quiet," one investor said kindly, as if quietness were a symptom of illness. Nina would lay her hand on my arm and squeeze it, warning and thank you, all wrapped together. Michael, a client who had become a close friend, not a lover, emailed once, "If you ever need to get out, text me and I'll get you a cab." I saved that custody of kindness in a folder labeled "People Who Are Fine." Keeping those small human things anchored me. The closer we came to the lunch, the more Ethan's behavior tightened like a muscle. He monitored guest lists, rehearsed speeches, and asked me in passing if I'd help with the slide deck. I smiled and said yes. Feeding him confidence like a drug, I meant to withdraw slowly. On the morning of the investor luncheon, the city felt unusually still, the kind of silence that presses against the ears. I sat at my kitchen counter, hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold, and watched the steam curl into nothing. My phone buzzed, a brief note from Maya. "We're green. We have verified the shell company documents. We have the transfer chain. The auditors are ready to hand this to the board." My heart beat a steady, traitorous rhythm. I tasted metal and coffee and the electric thrill of the plan about to be set in motion. I dressed in the kind of outfit that doesn't scream victory, but radiates competence. A tailored blazer, comfortable heels, hair penned back so nothing distracted from what I would say. I wanted to be invisible and lethal. I wanted them to underestimate me, as they always had. On the subway, I read the draft of the board packet one last time. Each page was a small catastrophe for him. Annotated receipts, timestamps, cross-referenced messages. Every line had been double-checked. Maya's team had added notes linking payments to events and provided a clean narrative for investigators. When I arrived at the venue, I could feel the air change, the scent of perfume, polished shoes, the soft rustle of napkins over conversation. Ethan found me before I found him, eyes wide with the kind of glee that used to feel like home. He kissed my cheek in front of a group of investors and introduced me. "This is Clara. She's the engine." He said it with possessiveness and pride. I smiled and nodded and felt the entire room tilt toward me, like a stage. He was about to make his speech. The lights dimmed. He stood at the lectern, all charm and hunger. Cameras tilted toward him. Somewhere in the ceiling, a waiter balanced a tray, like a tightrope walker. I slid into my seat and placed the folder on my lap, the weight of it like a sleeping thing. Under the table, my fingers found Nina's hand. She squeezed once. When Ethan smiled into the microphone and began his opening lines about vision and growth, I felt a calm I hadn't known I could hold. I watched him speak, every cadence and practiced pause. Then, as he raised a glass for a toast, my phone vibrated. A new message from Maya. "They're pulling him aside. Board is in the back room. Cameras are outside. Are you ready?" My breath hitched. The room hummed like a hive. My hand tightened on the folder until my knuckles whitened. "Yes," I typed, and my thumbs trembled with the thrill of the moment. I looked up as Ethan lifted his glass. The room held its breath with him. And in that moment, watching his face alight with triumph, I realized the thing I'd planned for months would unfold in less than a minute. The toast was interrupted by a voice from the back. "Mr. Vale, a word, please." He turned, puzzled. The board member who'd been his closest ally walked toward him with a face like a ledger finally balanced. Cameras swiveled. Ethan looked at me. confusion flickering, then anger, like a thin skin tearing. The microphone crackled. Someone at the head table stood. A murmur rose and spread, a wave. My heart pounded against my ribs like a second drumline. The door to the back room opened, and two men in suits I did not recognize came out, badges glinting in the banquet light. The air inside the banquet hall turned viscous, like honey slowing mid-pour. Every sound, clinking glasses, camera shutters, the whispered confusion of investors melted into a dull hum. Ethan blinked, that familiar flicker of calculation flashing behind his eyes. Two agents stepped forward, their badges catching the gold shimmer of the chandeliers. "Mr. Ethan Vale," one of them asked evenly, "we'd like a word regarding financial discrepancies at Vale Plus Co. Media." The pause that followed was a living thing. It moved through the crowd, pricking skin and stirring whispers. Ethan's smile twitched, that PR-perfect grin faltering for the first time in years. "This must be a mistake," he said, the practiced warmth in his tone cracking around the edges. I could almost taste the tension, champagne, sweat, and the metallic tang of panic. The lead agent replied calmly, "We have a warrant to review certain transactions. You can accompany us voluntarily." Or, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. Ethan's eyes darted instinctively toward me. For a heartbeat, I saw the man who used to trust me with every part of his life. Then the recognition that I was the one who had lit this fuse. He mouthed the single word, "You?" I didn't move, didn't speak. I simply tilted my head slightly, acknowledgement, not denial. That's all it took for realization to bloom across his face like fire catching oxygen. The board chair rose, voice trembling slightly but controlled. "If you'll excuse us," she said to the guests. "This matter requires immediate attention." Her composure was impeccable, but I saw her eyes flick toward me, searching for confirmation of what she already suspected, that I had known. I gave her a faint nod, not proud, not smug, just steady. The agents guided Ethan toward the back room. Cameras trailed them like vultures circling fresh prey. He turned once more before disappearing, his voice low but audible enough for the nearest tables. "This is all a misunderstanding." No one believed him. Sienna, sitting 2 tables away in a champagne-colored gown, went pale. Her phone buzzed on the table, no doubt with texts from their shared handler, publicist, or perhaps the shared shame they'd just inherited. When the second agent asked her to come along for a few clarifying questions, she hesitated, eyes darting between Ethan and the crowd, then followed without protest. The door shut behind them with a soft click. And just like that, the golden couple the empire I'd built and he'd poisoned was gone. The room buzzed with subdued chaos. Guests leaned across tables, voices low but urgent. Someone whispered, "Did you know?" Someone else muttered, "He's done." I rose quietly, gathering the folder from my lap. The linen napkin slipped to the floor, but I didn't bother picking it up. Nina followed close behind, her face calm but eyes alight with disbelief and awe. "You actually did it," she whispered once we were clear of the crowd. "Not yet," I replied. "This is just gravity doing the rest." The next 48 hours unfolded like slow-motion retribution. By that evening, the story broke online, not from gossip blogs, but from a respected financial outlet. Vale Plus Co., under federal investigation for misuse of investor funds. The journalist I'd primed had played it exactly right. Factual, surgical, devastating. Within a day, every outlet from Forbes to TechWire picked it up. Ethan's face, the one that used to grin from top 40 under 40 lists, now appeared beneath headlines about financial misconduct and ethical collapse. Sienna's name surfaced too, though buried deeper, creative consultant tied to irregular transfers. Comment sections roared, investors distanced themselves, clients suspended contracts. The empire he'd built on charm was collapsing, brick by glittering brick. I stayed silent. When journalists called, I said only, "The board and legal authorities are handling this matter. My focus is on ensuring the company and our clients remain stable." Every word was chosen like a scalpel stroke, neutral, steady, professional. But beneath that surface calm, my blood thrummed with something indescribable, not joy exactly, but the fierce satisfaction of equilibrium restored. The board issued a formal statement. Ethan Vale was placed on indefinite leave pending investigation. I was appointed interim CEO. That night, I returned to the office empty now, except for the hum of machines and the ghost of our shared ambition. I walked through the glass-walled conference room where he'd once pitched our first investors, the same place where he'd kissed me after our first $1 million deal. The city stretched out beyond the windows, its lights blinking like indifferent stars. I should have felt victorious, triumphant. Instead, I felt clean. Ethan called 2 days later, blocked number. I shouldn't have answered, but I did. Clara. His voice rasped, strained, panicked, human in a way I hadn't heard in years. I don't know what you told them, but you have to stop this. You don't understand what they'll... I understand perfectly, I said, cutting him off. You built this. I just stopped pretending not to see it. He exhaled shakily. I made mistakes, yes, but I never meant. You meant every wire transfer, every lie, every promise to her, while you looked me in the eyes. He went silent. I could hear background noise, maybe an agent's footsteps, the click of a pen, the unraveling of everything. Finally, he whispered, You've ruined me. I didn't raise my voice. No, Ethan, you ruined yourself. I just stopped protecting you from the consequences. Click. In the following weeks, the world did what it always does, moved on to fresher scandals. Sienna rebranded herself as a piece of self, victim of toxic corporate culture. Her followers dipped, then rebounded when she posted a tearful apology video about being misled by someone she trusted. Effin, however, vanished. Word circulated that he'd taken a plea deal, handing over assets to avoid prison time. The company stabilized under new leadership. Nina and I rebuilt the brand with transparency and quiet integrity. The employees who'd been caught in the blast radius slowly returned to laughter, to late-night pizza, to believing again. And me, I learned the difference between power and peace. 3 months later, a letter arrived at my office. No return address, just my name written in familiar handwriting. Ethan's. Inside, a single sheet of paper. You got what you wanted. I hope it was worth it. I folded it neatly and placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk, under the first contract we ever signed together. It wasn't worth it. It wasn't about worth. It was about balance. That evening, I left the office early for the first time in years. The sunset spilled across the skyline, warm and indifferent. At home, I kicked off my heels and stepped barefoot onto the balcony. The city's noise softened below. Cars, sirens, laughter. Life. Moving on. I breathed in the cool air and felt the weight in my chest finally ease. Nina called just before dusk. You okay? She asked. I think so, I said. For the first time, I really think so. Weeks passed, the media moved on, the investors stayed. Vilco survived, smaller, leaner, but honest. And in a twist of poetic justice, one of our biggest new clients was a law firm specializing in financial compliance. Sometimes, during quiet mornings in the office, I'd catch a glimpse of Ethan's old framed article, Visionary Founders Changing the Future. I didn't take it down. I wanted it there, a reminder of what blindness costs. A year later, I saw Sienna at an industry event. Her smile was brittle, her fame dimmed but not gone. She approached cautiously, glass of white wine trembling just slightly in her hand. Clara, she said, eyes darting. I wanted to say, I held up a hand. Don't. She blinked. I just wanted you to know I didn't know everything. I nodded once, then maybe learn to ask next time, and I walked away. When people talk about revenge, they imagine fire, chaos, rage, destruction. But real revenge isn't fire. It's ice. It's calm, quiet, deliberate. It's the moment you stop needing validation and start reclaiming truth. Ethan took 5 years of my life, my love, my trust, and turned them into currency. So I took back something he didn't expect: control. And in the process, I realized something bigger. The best revenge isn't watching them burn. It's watching yourself bloom where they said you couldn't. If you've ever been betrayed, remember, silence and strategy can be louder than any scream. Don't just get even, get free. If this story hit home, hit like, share it, and subscribe for more stories where justice finally gets the last word.